Nobody told you the world was different back then. It didn't need explaining. You climbed into the boot of the car without a second thought. You sat on a lap in the front seat, no belt in sight. You carried a penknife to school, bought bangers from the corner shop, and rode home unhelmeted on a moped that nobody questioned. None of it felt dangerous. It just felt like Tuesday. This is 20 things British kids did in the 1970s that would get a parent arrested today. Every single one of them was, at the time, completely, perfectly legal. 1. Riding in the boot. You climbed into the boot of the car, and nobody thought twice about it. That was the trip to the seaside, the trip to your nan's, the trip to anywhere too far to walk. The big estate car pulled up outside the house. The boot swung open, and that was your seat. Not a seat with a belt, not even a seat with a back, just the flat carpeted floor of the boot. Maybe a blanket thrown down, if your mum was feeling generous. You and your brother, or your cousin, or the kid from next door, all sprawled out back there for the whole journey. The cars of the time were built for exactly this kind of hauling. The Ford Cortina estate, the Austin Maxi, the Vauxhall Viva estate, the Morris Marina estate. Long, boxy cars with a boot that opened into one flat space, stretching almost from the back bumper to the rear seats. No partition. No cage separating the load area from the passengers. No rules at all about what went back there, whether it was a bag of coal, the family dog, the weekly shopping, or two children lying flat on their backs, watching the world go past upside down through the rear window. This was not against the law. It could not have been against the law, because at that point in time, there was no law in Britain saying how a child traveling in the back of a car had to be secured. Front seatbelts had been required equipment in new cars sold in Britain since 1968, but that only meant the car had to have them fitted. It said nothing about whether anyone actually had to wear one. The law making it compulsory for the driver and front seat passenger to buckle up did not come into force until the 31st of January, 1983. Before that date, wearing a seatbelt in the front of the car was a personal choice, and most people simply did not bother. And if the front seats had no legal requirement to be belted, the boot had nothing at all. There was no rule about rear seatbelts even being fitted until 1987. There was no rule about children under 14 actually wearing a seatbelt in the back until 1989. Adults in the back seat were not legally required to belt up until 1991, so a stretch of empty boot space, with no seatbelt fitted to it in the first place, sat completely outside any law that existed. Nobody was breaking a rule by putting a child back there, because the rule had not been written yet. You knew without anyone explaining it that the boot was just another seat. You climbed in the same way you climbed into the back seat. Nobody buckled you in because there was nothing to buckle. Nobody checked on you because there was nothing to check. It was simply how families traveled. There was no panic about it, no second thought, no quiet worry in the front seats about what might happen on a sharp bend or a sudden stop. The roads were quieter, the speeds felt slower, and the idea that a child needed to be strapped down for a car journey had not yet entered the national conversation. It would take another decade and a half of campaigns, statistics, and new laws before that idea became second nature. That was simply how things were done. But the boot was only the start of it. The front seat had its own freedoms too, and one of them put a child directly in the lap of the person doing the driving. 2. Sitting on a lap. You sat on your mum's lap in the front seat, or your dad's, and the car pulled away from the curb like that was the most normal thing in the world. Because it was. This wasn't something that happened occasionally, on a short trip round the corner when there wasn't room for everyone. For a lot of families, it was simply how a young child traveled in the front of the car. The child sat on the lap of whichever adult was in the passenger seat, sometimes even on the lap of the driver themselves, on a quiet road, with two small hands resting on the steering wheel, as if they were the ones in charge. Nobody filmed it to show how dangerous it was. Nobody wrote a letter to the council about it. It was just the seat a small child had, the same way the boot was a seat for an older one. The front passenger seat of a car in the 1970s held one adult and a small child squeezed into the same space. There was no booster seat raising the child up to see out of the window properly. There was no 5-point harness pinning small shoulders back against the seat. There was a bench or bucket seat built for one full-grown body, and a child simply fit into the gap left over. To understand why nobody stopped this, you have to understand exactly where the law stood at that point in British history. Seatbelts had been a required part of new cars in Britain since 1968. That year, a regulation came in saying that every new car sold had to have 3-point seatbelts fitted in the front. But fitting a belt and wearing a belt are two completely different things, and the law only dealt with the first one. For the next 15 years, having a seatbelt in your car and actually putting it on were treated as separate questions, and the second question had no legal answer at all. Government after government talked about changing that. Through the whole of the 1970s, ministers proposed new laws requiring drivers and front seat passengers to wear the belts that were already sitting there, already fitted, already doing nothing. And every single time, the proposal stalled. It got debated. It got argued over. It got shelved. The idea that the state could tell a grown adult to put a strap across their own chest inside their own car touched a nerve that ran right across the political spectrum. People talked about it as if it were a question of freedom rather than a question of safety. You heard the same kind of argument again and again on the news and in the pub, that a person should be free to take the risk on themselves, that being thrown clear of a crash was sometimes safer than being held in your seat, that the government had no business reaching into a private car and telling a free citizen what to strap to their own body. While all of that argument rumbled on through Parliament, nothing changed for the ordinary family getting in the car on a Saturday morning. The belt hung there in its little clip by the door pillar, sometimes used, very often not. And if the belt itself was treated as optional for a fully grown adult, nobody was about to start enforcing rules about how a small child sat in that same seat. There was no instruction, no leaflet through the letterbox, no driving test question about where a toddler should be positioned in the front of the car. The position a small child took up in that seat was left entirely to whatever felt practical to the parents at the time, and a lap was practical. It saved space. It kept the child close. It meant you didn't need to buy or fit anything extra. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about how differently road safety was thought about back then compared to now. Today, a parent buying a new baby seat will read about crash testing, weight categories, side impact protection, and the angle of the headrest. None of that existed as a concept that ordinary families were expected to know or worry about. Car safety, as something a parent actively managed for their child, simply was not yet a fully formed idea in everyday British life. The car was treated more like a room in the house on wheels. You sat where there was space. A small child on a lap took up no more thought than a small child sitting on a lap on the settee at home. The government did try to change public attitudes during this period, even while the law itself stood still. Throughout the 1970s, there was a long-running road safety campaign built around a simple, catchy phrase, clunk click every trip. The phrase referred to the sound of the car door closing, the clunk, followed by the click of the seatbelt buckle going in. Adverts ran on television, urging drivers to make that clunk and that click part of every single journey, no matter how short. It became one of the most recognized phrases in British road safety history, repeated so often that people who lived through the decade can still say it today without thinking. But a catchphrase is not a law, and a catchphrase certainly does not tell you anything about where a small child should sit. The campaign was aimed squarely at adults and their own seatbelts. It said nothing about laps, nothing about children in the front seat, nothing about how many people could safely fit into one space, designed for one body. Public information films from the period, when you go back and watch them now, show ordinary drivers being interviewed at the roadside, asked plainly why they didn't wear their belt. The answers tell you everything about the mood of the time. One driver explained flatly that he preferred to feel free while he was driving and had simply never worn one. Another argued that figures from other countries showed seatbelts hadn't actually reduced the number of accidents at all, an argument that simply wasn't true, but one that plenty of people repeated to each other as if it settled the matter. This was the climate the law had to fight against for 15 years before anything changed. Even after the law did finally change, it changed slowly and in pieces, never all at once. The 31st of January 1983 was the date that drivers and front seat passengers in Britain were legally required to wear a seatbelt for the first time. Almost overnight, the proportion of drivers and front seat passengers actually wearing a belt jumped from around 4 in 10 to roughly 9 in 10. That single change in the law did more in a matter of weeks than over a decade of advertising campaigns had managed to do through persuasion alone. It shows you just how much the law itself, rather than the message, was the thing that actually moved people. But even that 1983 law was about adults belting themselves in. It did nothing to address how a small child traveling in that same seat should be secured, because the law was written around the belt itself, and a small child sitting on a lap wasn't using the belt at all. Rear seatbelts weren't even required to be fitted in new cars until 1987. Children under 14 weren't legally required to wear a seatbelt in the back seat until 1989. It took until 1991 for the law to finally require adult passengers in the back seat to belt up as well. Each one of those changes arrived years apart, one small piece of legislation at a time, slowly closing a gap that had been wide open for the entire previous decade. So when you picture a small child sitting on a lap in the front seat, sometime in the mid-1970s, you have to picture it inside a country that hadn't yet decided, in law, that any of this mattered. The belt for the adult in that seat may or may not have been on, depending on the person and the mood that day. The child on the lap had no separate safety equipment at all, no booster, no harness, nothing built specifically for a smaller body, and nobody driving that car, nobody sitting in it, and nobody watching it pull away from the curb thought there was anything unusual happening. You knew the rule without being told, because there wasn't one to tell you. A child sat where there was room. The front seat had room on a lap. That was simply where you went. There's something worth noticing in just how slowly all of this changed. Britain didn't move from no seatbelt law to full seatbelt law in one clean step. It crawled there across more than 2 decades, 1968 to 1991, one small regulation at a time, while ordinary families carried on exactly as they always had in between each change. The lap in the front seat belonged to that long stretch of years when the law simply hadn't caught up with what was already known, even back then, about how a body moves in a crash. It wasn't reckless in the way that phrase sounds today. Nobody thought of themselves as taking a risk with their own child. It was simply the shape that an ordinary car journey took, in a world where seatbelt laws were still being argued about in Parliament, and a phrase about clunks and clicks was doing more of the persuading than any actual rule. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while the front seat held its own quiet freedoms, the very back of the car, the open boot, and the open flatbed of a van held an even bigger one. Because if a lap could hold a child safely enough for everyone's liking in the front, then an open load space at the back raised a question nobody back then thought to ask either. 3. Riding loose in the back of a truck. You stood up in the back of the wagon, holding onto the side, with the wind hitting you full in the face, and that was just how you got from one field to the next, or one farm to another, or sometimes just from one end of the village to the other, when a tractor and trailer happened to be going that way. This wasn't a special occasion. It wasn't something that only happened on the last day of the school holidays, when a farmer let the local kids climb up for a treat. For plenty of children growing up in Britain in the 1970s, riding loose in the open back of a flatbed truck, a farm trailer, or the bed of a small pickup was simply one of the ways you got moved around. If your dad worked on a farm, or drove a delivery wagon, or did building work that meant the back of a truck doubled as transport for the crew, you grew up with this. No bench seat, no bar across your middle, no roof over your head most of the time either. Just an open metal floor, sometimes with straw or sacking thrown down, and whatever you could grab onto when the truck pulled away. To understand why nobody stepped in and stopped this, you need to understand something that still surprises people when they hear it today. Even now, in the present day, there is still no specific law in Britain that makes it illegal to ride in the back of an open pickup truck. It sits in a strange grey area. The general rule that police and lawyers point to instead is a much broader one from the Road Traffic Act, which says a vehicle cannot be used in a way that creates a danger of injury to anyone, taking into account things like the number of passengers carried and the manner in which they are carried. That rule can be applied after the fact if something goes wrong. But there has never been a specific, plainly written law that simply says you must not let people ride in the open back of a truck. If that's true today, with decades of road safety law built up around it, you can imagine how completely unregulated it was back in the 1970s, when even front seatbelt wearing itself wasn't compulsory yet. This matters because it explains why nobody thought of it as breaking a rule. There simply wasn't a clear rule sitting there to break. The seatbelt laws that did eventually arrive were built entirely around belts fitted to seats inside a car. The law requiring drivers and front seat passengers to wear a seatbelt came into force on the 31st of January 1983. The law requiring rear seatbelts to even be fitted in new cars didn't arrive until 1987. The law requiring children under 14 to wear a seatbelt in the back came in 1989. None of those laws had anything to say about an open flatbed, an open trailer, or the back of a goods van, because those vehicles weren't built with passenger seatbelts in the first place. The law was being written for cars. The back of a farm trailer or a builder's lorry sat completely outside that conversation. And it wasn't just farms and building sites. Plenty of ordinary families used the same kind of open transport without thinking twice. A father with a small van for his trade might drop his own children off somewhere, sitting in the back among the tools, simply because it was the vehicle he had that day and there was room back there. A group of children heading to a school trip or a local fete might pile into the back of someone's pickup or trailer because it was the only vehicle big enough to take them all at once. Nobody asked whether there was a seatbelt back there because nobody expected one. The whole idea of a seatbelt being a requirement, rather than something fitted only in the front of a car if you were lucky, hadn't fully landed yet in the public mind. There's a particular kind of feeling that comes with standing in the back of a moving truck that's worth naming honestly, because it's part of why this memory sticks so clearly for people who lived it. It wasn't fear, it was the opposite of fear. It was the wind pulling at your hair, the smell of diesel and cut grass, the rattle of the metal floor under your feet, the sight of hedgerows and gateposts flashing past at a height and an angle you never got from inside a car. Children loved it precisely because it felt like nothing else available to them. There was no seatbelt clicking shut, no parent twisting round from the front seat to check you were settled. There was just you, holding onto the side rail or the cab roof, watching the road disappear behind you. Farm work made this kind of travel almost unavoidable for a stretch of rural Britain through the decade. Trailers towed behind tractors carried farm workers and their children out to distant fields at harvest time, because walking that distance simply wasn't practical, and there often wasn't a second proper vehicle to spare. The health and safety executive would later look back at exactly this kind of practice on farms and find that, across the years that followed, a number of deaths and serious injuries were tied directly to passengers being carried on farm trailers without proper restraint or safe seating. That later investigation only happened because the practice had been so widespread for so long that it eventually became impossible to ignore. But through the 1970s itself, riding on the back of a trailer at harvest time was simply part of how a farming family's year worked, children included. None of this was treated as neglect. It wasn't a sign of careless parenting or a shortcut taken by people who didn't care about their children's safety. It reflected something bigger about how the whole country thought about risk and transport at that time. Cars themselves were still being argued over in Parliament when it came to something as basic as whether a driver should be made to wear a belt that was already sitting right there in front of them. If lawmakers were still debating whether adults should be forced to use a seatbelt fitted directly in front of them in a car, there was no political appetite, no public pressure, and no obvious need felt by ordinary people to start regulating something as far removed from that conversation as the open back of a delivery van or a farm trailer. You knew without being told that the back of the truck was a place you could ride. Nobody handed you a rule about how to hold on, or where to sit, or what to do if the truck braked hard. You worked that out for yourself, the same way you worked out which bits of the metal frame were solid enough to grip and which bits rattled loose. That was simply how things were done, on a farm, on a building site, or in any family where a van or a pickup happened to be the vehicle going your way that day. There's a quiet thread running through all of this that's worth pulling on for a second. The reason none of it felt unusual at the time wasn't because people back then didn't care about their children. It was because the entire idea of car safety as something to actively manage and plan around was still being built piece by piece, one law at a time, stretched out across more than 2 decades. Riding loose in the back of a truck wasn't a gap in that system. It was simply outside the system altogether, because the system itself barely existed yet. And while the road carried its own quiet freedoms, the place children spent even more of their unsupervised time held an entirely different kind of risk altogether. One built not from speed and wind, but from solid metal, hard concrete, and a piece of playground equipment that spun faster the harder you pushed it. 4. The witch's hat, and the concrete below it. You ran across the playground, jumped onto the spinning frame, and grabbed whatever bit of metal was closest, and underneath your feet the whole time was nothing but hard, flat concrete. That was just what a playground looked like. Not a soft, bouncy surface in sight, not a strip of rubber matting anywhere near the swings or the slide, just tarmac, or sometimes plain compacted earth, stretching out underneath every single piece of equipment in the park. If you fell, and you did fall, because falling is what children do on playground equipment, you landed on the same hard ground a car would land on if it came off the road. There was a particular piece of equipment that almost every playground had, and it had a name that's worth remembering properly, because it tells you exactly what it was built to do. It was called the witch's hat. It looked exactly like its name suggested, a tall metal cone shape hanging from a central pole, with a ring of chains or bars running down from the point at the top to a circular rim near the bottom. Children would grab onto the bars or the chains, then run around the pole as fast as their legs could carry them, building up speed until the whole cone started to swing and spin and tilt at once. The faster you pushed it, the wilder it got. The whole point of the thing was to push it right to the edge of how fast it could go. This is exactly where the danger sat, and it's worth being precise about what that danger actually was, because the design itself created 2 completely separate ways to get hurt. The first was simple. If you were small, or you let go a moment too late, you could fall through the gap in the frame and land inside the cone itself, where the spinning structure could then knock you on the head as it kept turning around you. There was nothing built into the design to stop a child slipping through that gap. The second danger sat on the outside. If you lost your grip while the thing was spinning fast, you weren't just going to slip off gently, you were going to be flung outward, off the equipment entirely, onto the ground around it. And the ground around it, like the ground under every other piece of equipment in the playground, was concrete. That second point is the one that needs underlining, because it applied to almost everything in a 1970s playground, not just the witch's hat. The tall metal slides were the same story. They were built high, often higher than anything a child would be allowed to climb on today, with a steep metal chute that got hot in the sun and cold in the winter, and a ladder up the side, with rungs spaced for an adult's stride rather than a child's. At the bottom of that slide, where a child would land after coming down, there was no soft landing area built into the design. There was the same flat ground as everywhere else. This wasn't an accident or an oversight by anyone designing or installing the equipment. There simply wasn't a safety standard in Britain at that point that required anything different. The standard that eventually changed all of this, known by its official name BS NZ 177, covering exactly how playground surfaces had to absorb the impact of a falling child, didn't come into force until 1998. The matching standard for the equipment itself, BS 1176, arrived at roughly the same time, with the wider European standard taking full effect from the 1st of January 1999. Before that point, councils and schools installing playground equipment in Britain had nothing of that kind to follow. Most playgrounds built and used throughout the 1970s and 1980s were laid out on concrete, tarmac, or plain compacted earth, because that was simply what playgrounds were built on at the time. There was no rule saying it had to be anything else. It helps to picture exactly what that meant for the rest of the equipment too. The swings of the period were often built from heavy metal, with thick chains and solid metal seats, rather than the lighter rubber and plastic seats you'd find today, which meant that being struck by a swinging seat carried far more force behind it. There were roundabouts spun by hand, sometimes fast enough that children riding them had to lie flat and hold on with both arms just to avoid being thrown clear. There were tall climbing frames made entirely of scaffold-style metal poles, crisscrossing well above head height, with no rule requiring smaller gaps near the top to stop a younger child climbing further than they should, and no rule requiring guardrails or barriers at height either. Every one of these things sat directly above the same hard ground. None of this stopped children using the equipment exactly as it was designed to be used, at full speed, pushed to its limits. Quite the opposite. Part of the appeal of the witch's hat was precisely how fast and how wild you could get it spinning before you lost your nerve or your grip. Children would deliberately push it as hard as they physically could, then leap on at the last second, because the danger itself was part of the fun. Nobody supervising the playground stepped in to slow things down, because there was no rule that said they should, and because pushing equipment to its limits simply wasn't seen as something that needed stopping in the first place. It's worth being fair about why none of this felt strange to anyone at the time. Playground safety, as something that gets carefully designed, tested, and certified before a single child ever climbs on it, simply wasn't yet a fully developed idea in Britain. The whole concept of a critical fall height, the exact distance a piece of equipment is allowed to let a child fall before the ground beneath it has to be specially designed to cushion that fall, only became a properly defined part of British and European safety standards once BSEN 1177 was published. Before that standard existed, there was no number anyone was working to, no test anyone was running, no certificate anyone needed before installing a slide or a roundabout in a public park. There's also something worth saying honestly about how this is remembered now, because it isn't remembered with fear. Ask anyone who grew up playing on a witch's hat roundabout, and the picture that comes back isn't one of danger. It's the picture of the world spinning past in a blur, the chain biting into your hands as you held on tighter, the moment your feet left the concrete entirely, as the whole structure tilted under your weight. Scraped knees were simply part of growing up. A bruise from the swings, a graze from the slide, a bump on the head from the witch's hat. None of it was treated as a crisis. It was treated as Tuesday. That casual attitude toward injury runs right through this whole period, and it tells you something bigger about how Britain thought about risk for children in general. The idea that every fall needed to be designed away, that every surface needed to be cushioned, that every gap needed to be closed before a child ever touched the equipment, simply hadn't taken hold yet. It would take another 2 decades of campaigns, complaints from parents, and growing understanding of how children actually got hurt before that idea became the standard the whole country built its playgrounds around. You knew without being told that the playground had hard ground underneath it. Nobody warned you about it before you climbed the ladder or grabbed the chain, because there was nothing unusual to warn you about. The concrete was simply there, the same way the witch's hat was simply there, spinning faster the harder you pushed it, with nothing standing between you and the ground, except your own grip and your own balance. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while the playground asked you to test your own grip against gravity, there was something else within easy reach of any child in the 1970s that asked an entirely different kind of question. One that involved a lit match, a corner shop till, and a box that bangs. 5. Buying fireworks as a child. You walked into the corner shop with a fistful of coins, asked for a box of bangers, and the man behind the counter just rang it through, same as he would for a bag of sweets or a bottle of pop. Nobody asked how old you were. Nobody asked where your mum and dad were. There was no list of identification you needed to show, because there was no age printed anywhere on the box that said you had to be a certain number of years old to buy it. You picked your fireworks the way you picked anything else off a shelf, by what you fancied and what you could afford with the money in your pocket. To understand exactly how different this was from today, it helps to look at what the law actually says now and then, work backwards to see how recent all of it really is. Right now, under the Fireworks Regulations 2004, brought in under the Fireworks Act 2003, it is against the law to sell what's called an adult firework to anyone under the age of 18. Fireworks today are split into categories. The lower category, used for small indoor fireworks, has a minimum age of 16. The categories used for garden and outdoor fireworks, the kind that go bang or shoot up into the sky, carry a minimum age of 18. On top of that, it's also against the law for anyone under 18 to even be holding an adult firework in a public place, whether they bought it themselves or not. Break any of this today, and you're looking at an on-the-spot fine, or in more serious cases, prosecution, that can carry an unlimited fine and up to 6 months in prison. None of that existed in anything like this form when you were buying bangers from the corner shop. The category system that sorts fireworks by hazard level and ties each category to a minimum age comes from a British standard called BS 7114, and that standard wasn't published until the 30th of November 1988. Before that date, there simply wasn't a national system sorting fireworks into categories with ages attached to each one. The actual law making it a criminal offense to sell adult fireworks to under 18s, and to make it illegal for an under 18 to even possess one in public, didn't arrive until the Fireworks Act 2003 and the Fireworks Regulations 2004 that followed it. That means the entire framework of age restriction that feels so obvious and permanent today is barely 2 decades old. Throughout the whole of the 1970s, none of it was there. What did exist, going right back to the Explosives Act 1875, was a rule about where you could set fireworks off, not who could buy them. That old law made it illegal to throw or let off fireworks in a street, public highway, or other public place. And that particular rule has stayed in force, more or less unchanged, all the way through to today. So even in the 1970s, you weren't supposed to be setting bangers off in the middle of the road or chucking them at passing cars. But that rule was about location. It said nothing about age. It said nothing about who the shopkeeper was allowed to sell to. A child walking into a shop and buying a box of fireworks wasn't breaking that law at all, because that law had nothing to do with buying. It only covered where the things were used once you had them. This gap between what was regulated and what wasn't shaped the whole experience of bonfire night for a generation of British children. In the weeks running up to the 5th of November, shops would put their fireworks out on display, often right there on the counter or on a shelf near the sweets, and children would go in with pocket money saved up specially for the occasion. Bangers were small, loud, and cheap, which made them the most popular choice for children with only a little money to spend. Other common buys included rip-raps, jumping jacks, and small rockets, things that today would sit firmly in the adult-only categories because of the explosive content and the way they behave once lit. Once you had your fireworks, there was very little standing between you and lighting them yourself. Many households simply expected an older child, sometimes someone who was still well under their teens, to be capable of striking a match, lighting a firework, and standing well enough back to watch it go off. There wasn't a public safety campaign telling parents exactly when a child was old enough to be trusted with this, the way there is detailed safety guidance today from bodies like the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. The judgment of whether a particular child was sensible enough to be handed a box of matches and a banger was left entirely to the adults in that household, and it varied enormously from one family to the next. It's worth being honest about how this actually played out in practice, because it wasn't always careful or considered. Bonfire night in the 1970s produced a steady stream of burns cuts, and eye injuries among children every single year. And that pattern is exactly what eventually drove the government and safety bodies to start running public information campaigns, specifically aimed at young people. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, what got called shock advertising started appearing. Deliberately graphic safety films and adverts designed to frighten children into treating fireworks with more respect. These campaigns existed precisely because there was no legal age restriction doing that job instead. If the law wasn't going to stop a 10-year-old buying a box of bangers, the thinking went, then perhaps a frightening enough advert might make that same 10-year-old think twice before lighting one in their hand. There's something worth noticing in just how long this gap stayed open. It would have been easy to assume, looking back now, that an age restriction on something as obviously dangerous as fireworks must have existed for as long as fireworks themselves have been sold to the public. It didn't. Britain went through the entire 1970s, the entire 1980s, and most of the 1990s, with category systems either not existing at all or existing only as a voluntary industry standard, rather than something written into law with criminal penalties attached. It took until 2003, more than a century after the original Explosives Act, for Parliament to finally put a clear, enforceable age on who could buy and who could even hold one of these things in public. You knew without being told that buying fireworks was simply something you did once you'd saved up enough money and bonfire night was getting close. Nobody handed you a leaflet about which category you were old enough for, because categories didn't exist yet. The shopkeeper rang up your bangers the same way he rang up everything else on the shelf, and that was simply how the 5th of November worked, year after year, for an entire generation of British children, standing in the cold with a box of matches in one hand and something that bangs in the other. And while a corner shop till could hand a child something explosive without a second glance, there was another small object that almost every boy in the country carried in his trouser pocket as a matter of course, one with a folding blade that would get a modern school instantly locked down. 6. The penknife in your pocket. You carried a penknife in your trouser pocket, the same way you carried your bus fare and a hanky, and nobody at school so much as blinked. It was there to sharpen a pencil when the sharpener in your desk went missing. It was there to cut a length of string, whittle a stick down to a point behind the bike sheds, or open a bag of crisps if you couldn't be bothered to tear the packet. For a huge number of boys growing up in Britain in the 1970s, a small folding pocket knife was simply part of what you carried, the same way a comb or a few coins were. Nobody searched your bag for it. Nobody asked your teacher to check your pockets before you came through the school gates. It sat there, folded shut, doing nothing more dramatic than waiting to be useful. To understand exactly why nobody treated this as alarming, you have to look at what the actual law said at the time, because the answer is genuinely surprising. There was no general law in Britain making it a criminal offence to carry a knife in a public place at all. Not a watered-down version of today's law. Not a softer set of rules with a higher age limit. Nothing. The law that finally created that offence, known as Section 139 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988, didn't exist yet, because the Criminal Justice Act 1988 itself hadn't been written. That law arrived a full decade or more after the period this video is about, and it was that act, not anything from the 1970s, that first made it illegal to carry a bladed or pointed article in public without a good reason. This matters more than it might sound, because it means the entire legal framework that today's children grow up inside, the one that makes carrying any knife at all a potential criminal matter, simply hadn't been written when you were a child carrying a penknife to school. The law that specifically made it an offence to have a bladed article on school premises, a separate section of that same 1988 Act, known as Section 139A, came in at exactly the same time. Before that act existed, there was no specific criminal offence covering a child bringing a knife into a classroom either. That doesn't mean absolutely anything went. There was already a law from 1959, the Restriction of Offensive Weapons Act, which had specifically banned the manufacture, sale, and hire of flick knives, the kind that spring open at the press of a button. That ban came in because flick knives had become associated with violence between rival groups of young men in the years before it, and Parliament wanted that particular type of knife off the market entirely. But a flick knife and an ordinary folding penknife, the kind with a small blade you opened and closed by hand, were treated as completely different things. The penknife in your pocket wasn't the kind of weapon that law was written to stop. It sat in a different category entirely, the category of tool rather than weapon, and the law of the time reflected that distinction clearly. There was also, separately, a question of how old you had to be to buy one. That restriction came later than you might expect too. The Offensive Weapons Act, 1996, was the law that first set a minimum age for buying a knife, fixing it at 16, and even then, it carried a specific exception for exactly the kind of object we're talking about, a folding pocket knife with a blade under 3 inches. That exception meant the small penknife a child might buy or be given was treated as a different matter from a larger or more serious blade, right from the moment age restrictions on knife sales first appeared. The age limit on knife sales wasn't even raised to 18 until 2006, under the Violent Crime Reduction Act, decades after the period we're talking about here. So picture exactly where this leaves a child in the 1970s. There was no law against carrying a small penknife in public. There was no law against bringing one into school, and the only sale restriction that would eventually apply to buying one, set at 16 years old, wouldn't even exist as a piece of legislation for another 2 decades. A penknife wasn't hidden, smuggled in, or kept secret from teachers the way it would have to be handled in a school today. It sat in the same pocket as your conkers and your marbles, brought out openly whenever there was something that needed cutting, sharpening, or whittling. This shaped a whole set of ordinary boyhood activities that simply couldn't exist in quite the same way today. Whittling a stick into a spear shape during a walk in the woods, carving your initials into a tree or into the underside of a desk when nobody was looking, sharpening the end of a pencil down to a fine point because the classroom sharpener had snapped its blade again, cutting a length of garden twine to tie something together, or peeling an apple at lunchtime with a blade you'd brought from home rather than a plastic knife handed out by a dinner lady. None of these were treated as anything other than completely ordinary, because the object doing all of this work was treated as completely ordinary too. It's worth being precise about why this changed, because the change itself tells you something important. Concern about knife crime, particularly knives carried by young people, grew steadily through the 1980s and into the years that followed, eventually producing exactly the kind of legislation that didn't exist when you were carrying that penknife to school. The Criminal Justice Act, 1988, brought in the general public possession offense. Later laws kept tightening things further, adding the offense of threatening someone with a blade, raising the purchase age, and steadily expanding the list of weapons banned outright. Each one of those changes responded to a real and growing concern about serious violence, and none of them existed yet in the period this video is describing. That's the heart of why this memory feels so strange to look back on now. It isn't that the rules were looser, it's that the rules, in the specific shape they exist in today, simply weren't there at all. A penknife in a boy's pocket in 1975 wasn't breaking a quieter, gentler version of today's knife law. It existed entirely outside any law on the subject, in a country that hadn't yet decided this was something the criminal justice system needed to cover. You knew without being told that a penknife was something you carried, used, and put away again, and that nobody was going to stop you for having it. There was no rule to break because the rule itself hadn't been written. That was simply how a boyhood pocket was equipped, alongside the string, the conkers, and whatever else needed to fit in there that day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and while a blade folded shut in a trouser pocket raised no eyebrows at all, there was something else children handled with even more freedom. Something that involved a lit match, a corner shop counter, and an errand your own mother might send you on without a second thought. 7. Being sent to buy cigarettes. Your mum handed you the coins, told you what to ask for, and sent you down to the corner shop for a packet of cigarettes, and you went, the same as if she'd sent you for a loaf of bread or a pint of milk. This wasn't something you did in secret. It wasn't a trick you and your mates worked out between yourselves to get hold of cigarettes for a laugh behind the bike sheds. It was a straightforward errand, given to you by a parent who simply wanted their cigarettes and didn't see anything wrong with sending a child to fetch them. You'd walk in, ask for the brand by name, hand over the money, and walk back out with the packet tucked into your coat pocket, and the man behind the counter would think absolutely nothing of it. Here's where it gets interesting, because the law at the time was actually clearer on this than people remember, even though it was almost never enforced. The rule against selling tobacco to children in Britain wasn't something invented later on. It went all the way back to the Children Act 1908, and it was carried forward and tightened up in the Children and Young Persons Act 1933. That law made it an offense for a shopkeeper to sell tobacco or cigarette papers to anyone under the age of 16. And crucially, the law specified that this applied whether the cigarettes were for the child's own use or not. In other words, even sending a child in to buy cigarettes purely as an errand for a parent was, technically, exactly the kind of sale this law was written to stop. And yet it happened constantly, in shops up and down the country, without a flicker of concern from anyone involved. That gap between what the law said on paper and what actually happened on the ground is the whole story here. The legal age stayed fixed at 16 for an extraordinarily long time, from 1908 right through to the 30th of September 2007, when it was finally raised to 18 under the Children and Young Persons, Sale of Tobacco, etc., Order 2007. That means for the entire span of the 1970s, the legal age for buying cigarettes in Britain was 16, not 18, and even that lower limit was treated by shopkeepers and parents alike as something closer to a suggestion than a hard rule. The reason enforcement was so weak comes down to how the offense itself was structured. The law placed the responsibility squarely on the shopkeeper, not on the child. It was the shopkeeper who committed the offense by selling. A child standing at the counter asking for a packet of cigarettes wasn't, and still isn't today, committing any crime themselves by trying to buy them. There has never been an equivalent law making it illegal for the child to attempt the purchase, the way there is for alcohol, where it's actually an offense for someone under 18 to even try to buy a drink. With cigarettes, the entire weight of the law sat on one side of the counter, and the person on that side of the counter, in plenty of corner shops through the decade, simply didn't bother enforcing a rule that nobody seemed especially bothered about anyway. Shopkeepers who knew a family, who'd served that same household for years, who recognized a child as the son or daughter of a regular customer, sending them in on a familiar errand, had very little reason to refuse the sale. There was no requirement to ask for identification, because plenty of children that age didn't carry any, and there was no real system of spot checks or undercover testing to catch shops out the way there is today. The whole culture around the sale of cigarettes simply hadn't developed the suspicion and caution that exists now. A 10 or 11-year-old asking for 20.5, number 6 or a packet of players for their dad was, in the eyes of most shopkeepers, exactly the same as that same child asking for a loaf of bread for their mum. Nobody treated it as a transaction that needed extra thought. This casualness extended well beyond the simple errand of buying cigarettes for a parent. Plenty of children in the 1970s ended up smoking themselves at an age that would horrify a parent today, and the same loose enforcement that let a child buy cigarettes for an adult made it entirely possible for that same child to be sold a packet for their own use too, especially if they were old enough to look like they might be 16, or simply asked a shopkeeper who wasn't paying close attention. Smoking among teenagers, and sometimes children younger than that, was treated as an unfortunate but unremarkable fact of growing up in a country where around half the adult population smoked at some point through that decade. Cigarette adverts still ran in magazines. Packets sat openly on shop counters and shelves, with none of the plain, unbranded packaging or hidden display cabinets that exist today. There was no ban yet on smoking in pubs, in cinemas, on buses, or in most workplaces, which meant a child growing up in the 1970s was surrounded by cigarette smoke almost everywhere they went, long before they were old enough to buy their own. It's worth being precise about exactly how this contrasts with today's law. because the contrast tells the whole story. Right now, it's illegal for any shop to sell tobacco to anyone under 18, and that's been the case since 2007. The shopkeeper carries the same kind of legal responsibility they always did, but today, that responsibility is taken seriously, with age verification checks, mystery shopper testing carried out by trading standards officers, and serious financial penalties for shops caught breaking the rule. None of that machinery existed in the 1970s. The age limit on paper was lower, at 16 rather than 18, but the gap between that limit and what actually happened in practice was enormous, in a way that simply isn't true of the tightly enforced system that exists now. There's something worth sitting with in just how unremarkable this whole arrangement felt at the time. A parent sending their child to buy cigarettes wasn't seen as putting that child in any kind of moral or legal jeopardy. It was simply how the household ran. Money was handed over, an instruction was given, and the child went and did the job. The same as fetching the newspaper or running down for a tin of beans when the cupboard was bare. Nobody felt the need to explain to the child why this particular errand was different from any other, because in the world that child was growing up in, it genuinely wasn't treated as different at all. You knew without being told exactly which brand to ask for, because you'd heard it asked for at home 100 times before. You knew the shopkeeper would hand the packet over without a second glance, because that's what happened every single time you'd done this errand before. There was no awkward pause, no question about your age, no hesitation on either side of the counter. That was simply how things were done, in a Britain where the law on paper said one thing, and the corner shop till said something quite different. And while a child could walk a packet of cigarettes home from the shop without anyone batting an eye, school itself carried its own set of routines around discipline, ones that involved a teacher's open hand, a board rubber thrown across a classroom, and a kind of casual physical punishment that sat entirely outside anything you'd find acceptable in a classroom today. 8. The board rubber and the open hand. You were chatting in class, or yawning, or simply staring out of the window when you should have been listening, and the next thing you knew, a board rubber had come flying across the room and caught you on the side of the head. This wasn't the formal kind of punishment that involved being sent to an office and told to bend over a desk. This was something much more casual, much more immediate, and it happened in ordinary classrooms up and down the country throughout the decade without anyone treating it as remarkable. A teacher losing patience mid-lesson didn't always reach for an official punishment book or send you to see the headmaster. Sometimes they simply reacted on the spot with whatever was closest to hand, and a wooden-backed board rubber with a small metal hook on one side, thrown hard across a classroom at a child who'd been talking out of turn, was a genuinely common feature of school life at the time. It's worth separating this kind of punishment clearly from the formal, official version, because they operated quite differently, even though both were happening in the very same schools, often in the very same week. The formal version, properly recorded and sanctioned, was caning or strapping, carried out by a headmaster or a senior teacher, often behind a closed office door, sometimes following a specific procedure that the school had agreed to as policy. That was corporal punishment in its recognized deliberate form, and it remained completely legal in British state schools, right up until the Education Act 1986 banned it, with that ban only taking full effect the following year. It stayed legal in private schools considerably longer still, surviving until 1998 in England and Wales, and even later in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But alongside that formal system sat something far less structured. This was the heat of the moment hit, the slap, the cuff round the ear, the thrown object, dished out by an ordinary classroom teacher who simply lost their temper and reacted physically without any paperwork attached. People who lived through schooling in this period described this low-level, informal physical punishment as something that ran constantly underneath the more official system, separate from any caning that might also have been happening, and treated by everyone involved, staff and pupils alike, as simply part of how a classroom was managed. PE teachers in particular had a reputation for being quick with a fist or a boot if a pupil messed about during a lesson, and teachers in ordinary classrooms threw board rubbers, chalk, or anything else within reach at pupils who were talking, daydreaming, or otherwise not paying attention. This kind of punishment wasn't hidden or denied. It happened openly, in front of an entire class, with no attempt made to disguise what had occurred or pretend it hadn't happened. A teacher might throw a board rubber across a room in the middle of explaining a maths problem, hit its target, and simply carry on with the lesson as if nothing unusual had taken place, because in that classroom, at that moment, nothing unusual had taken place. The pupil who'd been hit didn't run to tell their parents in outrage, and even if they had, there was no real expectation that anything would come of it. This was simply how a noisy or distracted child got brought back into line. To understand why this was tolerated so widely, it helps to look at how slowly British attitudes toward physical discipline in schools were actually shifting during this exact period. The Plowden Report, published back in 1967, had already recommended abolishing corporal punishment in primary schools specifically, and in the years following that report, the cane was in fact abolished in most primary schools by the early 1970s. But that recommendation, and the change that followed it, only really addressed the formal, official punishment. It did nothing to touch the informal, off-the-record physical punishment happening in classrooms in between those official cases. And it certainly didn't reach secondary schools, where formal corporal punishment carried on for the entire decade and well beyond it. There's an important point buried in exactly why people who lived through this don't necessarily remember it as traumatic, even though by today's standards, it plainly involved teachers assaulting children. The fear of it happening, rather than the act itself, was often the more powerful force at play. A pupil who was never personally hit by a teacher still grew up knowing it could happen to anyone at any moment. For talking, for yawning, for simply not paying close enough attention. That atmosphere of constant low-level threat shaped classroom behavior just as much as any actual incident did. Campaign groups arguing against corporal punishment in this exact period made precisely this point, stating clearly that it didn't matter whether a particular child was ever actually struck, because the fear created by the system itself was capable of affecting the educational and psychological development of every child sitting in that classroom, whether they personally experienced it or not. It also helps to understand that this wasn't a fringe or unusual view, held only by a small number of strict teachers. Public opinion through much of the 1970s remained genuinely split, and there was active, organized resistance from pupils themselves against this entire culture of physical discipline. In May 1972, an estimated 10,000 schoolchildren walked out of lessons and marched through central London, specifically to protest the use of corporal punishment, organized by a group called the Schools Action Union. That protest and others like it through the late 1960s and early 1970s came directly out of frustration with exactly this combination, both the formal caning that schools still openly practiced and the informal hitting that happened alongside it, all within a system that the children living inside it were beginning to push back against, even while most of the adults running those schools still treated it as entirely normal. The casualness of all this is what stands out most clearly looking back from today. A teacher throwing a board rubber or cuffing a pupil round the ear for messing about wasn't treated as an isolated lapse by an unusually harsh individual. It was woven into the ordinary texture of school life, sitting comfortably alongside the more formal, recorded punishments that existed at the same time. Nobody escaped it entirely, in the sense that even pupils who personally avoided being struck still grew up inside a school culture where it was understood to be a normal and accepted response to bad behavior, distraction, or simply being a child who hadn't quite worked out yet how to sit still and pay attention. You knew without being told that talking out of turn, or daydreaming, or failing to listen properly carried a real physical risk attached to it. Nobody had to explain the rule to you, because the rule made itself perfectly clear the first time you saw it happen to someone else in your class. That was simply how a 1970s classroom worked, long before any law existed to stop it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the board rubber and the open hand were only the casual, everyday end of a much more deliberate and formally sanctioned punishment that existed in exactly the same schools, one that involved being summoned to an office, told to wait outside a closed door, and given a punishment that the whole system had agreed, in writing, was a perfectly acceptable way to discipline a child. 9. The cane. In the headmaster's study. You were told to go to the headmaster's office, and the walk there felt longer than it had any right to be, because everyone in that school knew exactly what waited behind that particular door. This was the formal version of school discipline, carried out properly, with a kind of ceremony attached to it that made it feel even worse than the casual hitting that happened in ordinary classrooms. You'd be sent for, usually by another teacher who'd reported whatever you'd done, and you'd wait outside the headmaster's study, sometimes for what felt like an agonizingly long time, before being called in and told to bend over a chair or a desk to receive the cane across your backside or your hand. This wasn't an accident of temper, the way a bored rubber thrown in the heat of the moment might be. This was the school's official, recognized punishment, administered deliberately, often following a set procedure that had been agreed and written down by the school itself. To understand exactly how long this remained completely legal, you need to look at the actual dates, because they're later than most people expect. Corporal punishment stayed legal in British state schools throughout the entire 1970s, and well into the 1980s. It was the Education Act 1986 that finally brought in a ban, with that ban only coming into force the following year, in 1987. That means a child going through state school in Britain in the 1970s, the entire decade, was attending school inside a legal system that openly permitted teachers to physically beat pupils as an officially sanctioned punishment. There was no ambiguity about it. It wasn't an abuse of the rules. It was the rules. Private schools held on to the practice considerably longer still. Even after state schools were banned from caning pupils in 1987, a loophole in the legislation allowed independent schools to keep using corporal punishment, including in cases where a child's place had been paid for through public money under the Assisted Places scheme. That particular loophole wasn't closed until 1998. Private schools in Scotland held on until the year 2000, and Northern Ireland's private schools continued until 2003. So even by the standards of the rest of Britain, which had already banned the practice in state education, a child at a private school could still legally be caned right up to the very end of the 20th century and into the next. The actual implements varied depending on which part of the country you were in and which school you attended. In Scotland, schools used something called the torse, a leather strap with separate tails at the end, applied to a child's hand. In England, a similar leather strap was also used in some schools, striking either the hands or the backside, depending on the school's particular custom. And then there was the cane itself, the thin length of wood most commonly associated with this period, swung across the hand or the backside, sometimes through clothing, sometimes not, depending on the school and the headmaster carrying it out. What made this particular form of discipline so different from the informal hitting happening in ordinary classrooms was the sense of process that surrounded it. A formal caning often involved being summoned specifically for that purpose, sometimes hours after the original offense had taken place, which meant a child might spend an entire school day knowing exactly what was coming at the end of it. The headmaster's study itself, oak-paneled in plenty of schools, carried a particular kind of dread precisely because everyone knew what that room was for. Being called there wasn't like being told off by a teacher in the corridor. It was an entirely different category of event, one with its own quiet ceremony built around it, designed in part to make the punishment feel as serious and as memorable as possible. It's worth being clear about how widely this practice was actually used, because some defenders of corporal punishment at the time argued it was only ever applied sparingly, as a last resort for the very worst behavior. Campaign groups opposed to the practice pushed back directly against that claim during this exact period. A group called STOP, made up partly of teachers themselves, specifically called on the government to gather statistics from school punishment books up and down the country in order to demonstrate that caning and strapping were being used habitually, rather than sparingly, in school after school, far more often than supporters of the practice were willing to admit. The political resistance to ending this practice ran surprisingly deep, right up to the very top levels of government. Labour Party conferences finally adopted a clear position against corporal punishment in 1980, and it was Labour votes in Parliament that eventually secured the full abolition of caning in state schools in 1986. But that final vote passed by a margin of just one. A number of Conservative members of Parliament, who would otherwise have voted to keep the practice legal, happened to be held up in traffic ahead of a royal wedding taking place the following day, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was known to support the continued use of corporal punishment, was occupied entertaining a visiting guest at the time of the vote and missed it entirely. The end of legal caning in British state schools, something that today seems like an obvious and overdue change, very nearly didn't happen when it did, decided in the end by little more than chance absences in a parliamentary vote. There's a particular argument that's worth understanding properly, because it kept the practice going for as long as it did. Plenty of people who had themselves been caned as children, including many in positions of influence over school policy, genuinely believed the experience had done them no lasting harm, and some argued it had actively shaped them into better, more disciplined adults. That belief, repeated across generations, gave the practice a kind of inherited legitimacy that made it far harder to challenge than its actual effects on children probably deserved. It took sustained pressure, eventually reaching all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, before British law finally caught up with the argument that beating a child as a form of officially sanctioned school discipline was something that needed to stop entirely, regardless of how many adults insisted it had never harmed them personally. You knew without being told exactly what waited behind that particular office door, because everyone in your school had either experienced it themselves or watched someone else walk towards it with the same dread written across their face. That was simply the system every child in Britain grew up inside throughout the 1970s, a system written into school policy, backed by law, and defended right up to the floor of Parliament itself. And it was exactly this system, the formal caning, that so many children feared and so many adults defended, that eventually pushed a generation of British schoolchildren to do something almost nobody expected, walking straight out of their own classrooms and marching through the streets of central London to say, loudly and publicly, that they had simply had enough of it. 10. Walking out to march. On Trafalgar Square. You weren't sat at your desk that morning. You were out on the street, walking alongside thousands of other schoolchildren, all marching together towards the middle of London, with banners held up over your heads. This wasn't a one-off act of mischief, dreamed up by a handful of troublemakers, skipping a lesson for the fun of it. On the 17th of May 1972, an estimated 10,000 schoolchildren across Britain walked out of their classrooms on the same day, in direct response to a call made by an organisation called the Schools Action Union, and a huge number of them converged on central London, specifically to protest against corporal punishment. Central London came to a genuine standstill that day, with police struggling to contain the crowds of children marching through the streets, carrying banners that read "No to the cane." To understand why this happened, and why it happened in exactly this period, rather than earlier or later, you have to look at where the school strike movement had actually come from. It didn't appear out of nowhere in 1972. It built up gradually over the preceding years, starting with smaller, local protests that spread outward as pupils, in different parts of the country, realized they weren't alone in their frustration. One of the earliest of these took place in March 1968, when hundreds of pupils at Miles Platting Secondary Modern School in Manchester staged their own strike, specifically in response to excessive use of the torse, the leather strap with separate tails used in some British schools at the time. Students involved in that strike went on to form the Manchester Union of Secondary Students, and similar groups followed quickly afterwards, including the Swansea Union of Progressive Students, the Bristol Sixth Form Alliance, and the Cardiff Union of Secondary Schools. The Schools Action Union itself, which eventually organised the much larger national strike in 1972, existed as an active movement between 1968 and 1974. It was a children-led organisation, run by school pupils themselves, rather than by adult campaigners on their behalf. And one of its founding members, Trisha Jaffe, had spent time in Paris during the period of civil unrest there in May 1968, where she formed connections with student protest movements on the continent that helped shape how the British school strikes were eventually organized. This wasn't an isolated British phenomenon. It connected to a much wider international mood of young people pushing back against institutions and authority structures that had gone largely unquestioned for generations, and British schoolchildren protesting the cane fit squarely inside that broader pattern. When the day of the big national strike finally arrived in May 1972, the scale of it caught a lot of adults off guard. 10,000 children walking out of school on a single day in coordinated fashion was not something the authorities of the time were prepared to simply wave through. Police actively worked to stop the marching children from occupying Trafalgar Square itself, which had clearly been the intended destination, and the crowds were eventually dispersed by officers determined not to let the protest establish itself in one of the most symbolically important public spaces in the entire country. The image of children, some of them barely teenagers, being confronted and moved on by police in the heart of London speaks to just how seriously the protest was taken by the authorities, even while plenty of adults outside the protest dismissed the children's complaints entirely. That dismissal is worth understanding properly because it shaped the entire political environment the strike took place in. The Tory-supporting press of the time widely mocked or rejected the arguments being made by groups like STOP, a campaign organization partly made up of teachers themselves who opposed corporal punishment, and by extension, the children's own protest movement. STOP had specifically argued that the fear created by corporal punishment, simply hanging over a classroom as a constant possibility, was capable of damaging a child's educational, psychological, and even sexual development, regardless of whether that particular child was ever actually struck. That argument, echoed by the short-lived National Union of School Students, was treated by much of the establishment press as overblown or unserious, even as the scale of the children's own protest suggested a very large number of pupils across the country felt exactly the opposite. The political weight of this protest movement, and others like it through the period, eventually fed into a much longer legislative struggle that didn't actually reach its conclusion for another 14 years. Britain remained one of the last countries in Western Europe still permitting corporal punishment in schools throughout this entire stretch. Other European nations had abandoned the practice far earlier, some going back centuries. Poland banned corporal punishment in schools as far back as 1783, a prohibition still written into the country's constitution today. Finland followed in the late 1800s. Even the Soviet Union had abolished school corporal punishment by 1917. Britain, by contrast, held on to the practice right through the marching children of 1972, right through the rest of the decade, and into the mid-1980s, before its parliament finally agreed to end it in state schools. The eventual vote that abolished corporal punishment in British state schools, in 1986, passed by the narrowest possible margin, a single vote, decided in part by a handful of Conservative MPs, who happened to be delayed in traffic ahead of a royal wedding the following day, and by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's own absence, while she entertained a visiting guest. That vote, 14 years after 10,000 children had marched through central London demanding exactly this change, shows just how slowly institutional Britain moved on an issue that the children directly affected by it had already identified, named, and protested against as early as 1972. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that this entire protest movement was driven by children themselves, organized by children themselves, and carried out on the streets by children themselves, rather than handed down to them by sympathetic adults acting on their behalf. The Schools Action Union wasn't a parents' group or a teachers' union speaking for pupils. It was pupils speaking for themselves, walking out of their own classrooms, marching through their own capital city, demanding an end to a punishment that adults in positions of authority kept insisting was either necessary or harmless. Whatever you think about the wisdom or judgment of children organizing a national strike, the scale of it, 10,000 of them on a single day, tells you something real about how widely felt the anger over corporal punishment actually was at the time, far beyond what the dismissive press coverage of the period suggested. You knew without being told why 10,000 other children had walked out alongside you that day, because the fear of the cane wasn't an abstract idea to any child living through a 1970s British school. It was something you'd witnessed, dreaded, or experienced directly. And on that particular day in May 1972, an entire generation of schoolchildren decided collectively that this was something worth marching through the streets of London to say out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the classroom and the headmaster's study weren't the only places where the rules of the decade allowed something that would be unthinkable today. Step outside the school gates and onto a road on two wheels, and you'd find a freedom that, right at the very start of the 1970s, hadn't yet been written into law at all. 11. Riding unbelted, in the front seat. You climbed into the front seat next to your dad, pulled the door shut, and that belt just hung there in its clip by the door pillar, the whole journey, completely untouched. This wasn't unusual behavior reserved for careless drivers or families who didn't think about safety. It was simply how almost everyone traveled in the front of a car through the 1970s, child or adult, regardless of how careful or sensible they considered themselves to be. The belt was there. It had been fitted in the car since new, and it sat unused, journey after journey, year after year, because wearing it was treated as entirely optional. The reason for this comes down to a very specific gap in British law that lasted far longer than most people expect. Seatbelts had been required equipment in new cars sold in Britain since 1968, which meant the belt itself was always there, ready to be used. But the law stopped at fitting. It said nothing about wearing. For the whole of the 1970s, Parliament debated, proposed, and then repeatedly failed to pass legislation that would have made wearing that belt compulsory. Government after government brought the idea forward. Every single time, it stalled, got argued over in the House of Commons, and was eventually shelved without becoming law. It wasn't until the 31st of January 1983 that wearing a seatbelt in the front of a car finally became a legal requirement for drivers and front seat passengers in Britain. What's worth sitting with here is just how strange that 15-year gap looks from today's perspective. The seatbelt itself, sitting in its clip, wasn't a new invention by the 1970s. The basic three-point design had already proven itself effective at reducing injuries, and the government's own road safety campaigns through the decade openly acknowledged this. And yet making people actually use it remained politically impossible for year after year, debate after debate, because enough people in Parliament and enough people in the country at large genuinely believed that being told to wear a seatbelt represented an unacceptable intrusion into personal freedom. That argument, framed around individual liberty rather than safety, ran right through the public conversation of the time. People talked about the issue as though the government reaching into a private car and dictating what a person strapped across their own body was somehow a different category of regulation entirely, separate from all the other rules that already governed how a car had to be driven. You'd hear the same handful of arguments repeated in pubs, on the news, and in newspaper columns. Some people insisted that being thrown clear of a crashing car was actually safer than being held inside it by a belt. Others pointed to figures from other countries claiming seatbelts hadn't actually reduced accident numbers at all, an argument that wasn't true, but one that got repeated with total confidence regardless. While that argument dragged on year after year in Parliament, the government did try to shift public behaviour through persuasion rather than law. And the most famous attempt became one of the most recognised pieces of road safety messaging in British history. The campaign was built around a simple phrase: clunk click every trip, referring to the sound of a car door shutting, followed by the click of a seatbelt buckle going in. Adverts ran constantly on television throughout the 1970s, urging drivers to make both sounds part of every single journey they made, no matter how short. The phrase became so widely repeated that people who lived through the period can still recite it today without having to think about it. But a catchphrase, however memorable, isn't the same thing as a law, and persuasion alone clearly wasn't shifting actual behavior anywhere near as much as the government hoped. Public information films from the era, when you go back and watch the ordinary roadside interviews conducted with drivers at the time, capture exactly how unconvinced large parts of the public still were. One driver, asked directly why he didn't wear his belt, said simply that he preferred to feel free while driving, and had never worn one. Another argued, confidently and incorrectly, that continental statistics showed seatbelts hadn't reduced accident numbers at all. These weren't fringe opinions held by a tiny stubborn minority. Before legislation finally passed in 1983, only around 4 out of every 10 drivers and front seat passengers were actually wearing their belt, despite years of advertising telling them to. The moment the law did finally change, the contrast was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks of the new legislation coming into force, on the 31st of January 1983, observed seatbelt wearing rates among drivers and front seat passengers jumped from around 40% to roughly 90%. Research carried out afterwards by the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents found a 25% reduction in driver fatalities and a 29% reduction in fatal injuries among front seat passengers in that very first year the law was in effect. It's estimated that the new law saved the lives of around 240 drivers and roughly 150 front seat passengers in 1983 alone, with similarly large numbers the following year. A decade and a half of advertising, persuasion, and government campaigning had achieved far less than a single piece of legislation managed within a matter of weeks. This tells you something important about exactly why a generation of British children grew up riding unbelted in the front seat as a matter of routine. It wasn't that families didn't care about safety, or that parents were being careless with their children's lives. It was that the entire culture surrounding car safety, the assumption that wearing a belt was simply something you did automatically every time you got in a car, hadn't been built yet, either by law or by habit. The belt existed, the advertising existed, but the legal requirement that would have finally tipped behavior from optional to automatic didn't exist until 1983, which meant for the whole of the previous decade, climbing into the front seat and simply not bothering with the belt was the completely ordinary, unremarkable thing to do. You knew without being told that the belt hanging in its clip was there if you wanted it, but that nobody, including the adult driving the car, was actually going to insist on it. There was no seatbelt warning light on the dashboard nagging at you, no chime sounding until you clicked it in, none of the small automatic reminders that exist in every car built today. The front seat simply worked the way it had always worked. Belt present, belt unused, journey after journey, for as long as the law allowed it to stay that way. And while the front seat carried this particular quiet freedom for drivers and the adults sitting beside them, an entirely separate set of children, sitting just a few feet further back in the very same car, were living through a gap in the law that would last even longer still. 12. Sitting unbelted in the back seat. As a child, you sat in the back seat with your brothers and sisters, sliding sideways on the bench every time the car took a corner too fast, and nobody up front turned round to check whether any of you had a belt on, because most of the time, there wasn't even one to put on in the first place. The back seat of a 1970s family car was a completely different world from the front. Up front at least, a belt was fitted and sitting there, even if nobody used it. In the back, for an enormous number of cars on British roads through the decade, there often wasn't a rear seatbelt fitted at all, and even where one was fitted, there was no law anywhere requiring a child sitting in that seat to actually wear it. That particular gap in British law lasted far longer than most people now realize. To understand exactly how long this gap stayed open, it helps to walk through the dates properly, because the law changed in small separate steps over more than 2 decades, rather than arriving all at once the way people sometimes assume. New cars sold in Britain only had to come with rear seatbelts fitted as standard from 1987. That's nearly 20 years after front seatbelts became a fitting requirement in 1968. And fitting, as with the front seats, was still only half the story. The law that actually made it compulsory for children under 14 to wear a seatbelt in the back of a car, where one was fitted, didn't arrive until 1989. So for a child growing up through the entire 1970s, sitting unbelted in the back seat of a car wasn't a case of breaking a rule and getting away with it. There simply wasn't a rule. The law hadn't reached the back seat yet at all. This had a direct effect on how families actually used the back of their cars. Without a legal requirement forcing the issue, the back seat became, in a practical sense, exactly the kind of flexible space that estate car boots and open van beds also became, somewhere children sat, knelt, lay down, or moved around freely during a journey, depending on how many of them needed fitting in and how far the trip was. A bench seat across the back of a typical family saloon held 3 people across it reasonably comfortably, but families with more than 3 children, or families traveling with cousins, neighbors, or friends along for the ride, regularly squeezed more bodies into that space than the seat was strictly designed for, because there was no seatbelt requirement, creating a hard limit on how many bodies could occupy it. Children in the back of the car during this period often knelt up facing backwards, watching the road disappear behind them through the rear window, something that's almost impossible to picture happening in a modern car fitted with rear-facing child seats, integrated headrests, and mandatory belt use for every single occupant. There was nothing stopping a child from doing this in the 1970s, because nothing in the law addressed how a child in the back seat was meant to be positioned at all. The whole question of where exactly a small body should sit, facing which direction, secured by what, simply hadn't been worked out yet, either in legislation or in the kind of safety advice that gets handed to new parents automatically today. It's worth being precise about why this particular gap lasted so much longer than the front seat equivalent. The front seat law arrived in 1983, partly because it was, in political terms, a relatively contained question. It asked whether an adult driver or an adult front seat passenger should be required to use a belt that was already sitting there in front of them. The back seat question was more complicated because it involved both whether rear belts needed to be fitted in the first place and separately whether children specifically needed protecting in a way that went beyond simply expecting an adult to click a belt into place. Those 2 separate questions, fitting and wearing, had to be worked through one after another, rather than all at once, which is exactly why the law moved in such small, slow steps across the whole of the 1980s, rather than arriving as a single complete package. There's a wider point buried in this slow timeline that's worth drawing out properly. Car safety, as a fully developed area of public policy with a clear, comprehensive set of rules covering every seat in the vehicle, simply didn't exist yet as a finished idea anywhere in Britain through the 1970s. It was being built piece by piece, argued over piece by piece, and legislated piece by piece over a period stretching from 1968 right through to 1991, when the very last gap, adult passengers in the back seat, was finally closed. A child in the back of a car in 1975 wasn't living inside a half-finished version of today's safety system. They were living inside a system that, when it came to the back seat specifically, hadn't really started yet. None of this stopped families traveling, of course, and it didn't stop children enjoying exactly the kind of freedom that an unrestrained back seat offered. Long journeys to the seaside or to visit relatives became something closer to an extended game played out across the back seat. Children lying flat across laps, climbing between the front and back if the car had a flat enough floor, or simply sprawling out, however felt most comfortable for that particular stretch of motorway. Parents driving up front weren't ignoring an obvious danger that everyone else somehow understood and avoided. They were driving through a world where nobody around them, no law, no advertising campaign, no piece of official guidance, had yet drawn a clear line between what counted as safe and what didn't. Specifically for a child sitting in the back, you knew without being told that the back seat was a place where the rules of the front seat simply didn't apply. Nobody told you to belt up back there, because in plenty of cars, there wasn't a belt to put on, and even in the ones that did have one fitted, nobody was legally required to make you use it. That was simply how the back of the car worked, for the whole of the 1970s and well into the following decade, while the law slowly, separately, and much later than you might expect, finally caught up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while children in the back seat sat through this entire gap in the law completely unaddressed, the adults sitting right alongside them, in that very same back seat, were about to find themselves waiting through an even longer stretch still, one that wouldn't close until the law finally caught up with every single person traveling in a British car, front or back, child or adult, all at once. 13. Adults riding unbelted in the back seat. Your nan sat in the back seat on the way home from Sunday dinner, with no belt across her at all, chatting away the whole journey, and nobody thought to mention it, because there was nothing to mention. By the time you reach this point in the story, the pattern should already feel familiar, but this particular gap deserves its own attention, because it lasted longer than almost any other piece of seatbelt law in Britain. While children under 14 finally became legally required to wear a rear seatbelt, where one was fitted, from 1989 onward, that same requirement simply didn't apply to adults sitting in the back of the car. An adult sitting in the rear seat of a British car could travel completely unbelted, perfectly legally, right through to 1991. It took until that year for the law to finally close the very last gap in the entire seatbelt story, the one covering adult passengers in the back seat. This means that for an enormous stretch of time, a genuinely strange situation existed inside the very same car. The driver and front seat passenger had been legally required to belt up since 1983. Children under 14 in the back joined that requirement from 1989, but an adult sitting in the back seat, perhaps a grandparent, an aunt, a family friend hitching a lift, remained completely free to travel without a belt at all, even after both of the other groups in the very same vehicle had already been brought under the law. 3 different rules, applying to 3 different groups of people, all sitting in the same car at the same time. None of them aligned until 1991 finally brought everyone under a single, consistent requirement. The numbers from the period make clear just how rarely adults in the back seat actually wore a belt before the law forced the issue. Government figures from the Department for Transport show that immediately before the 1991 law came into force, only around 10% of adult rear seat passengers were observed wearing a belt. That's a remarkably low figure, especially considering that front seat compliance had already reached around 90% following the 1983 law. It tells you something important about how differently people thought about risk, depending on which seat they happened to be sitting in. The same person who would never dream of driving without a belt in 1990 might happily climb into the back seat of someone else's car for a short trip and never give the missing belt a second thought. The moment the 1991 law actually came into force, the change in behavior was immediate and dramatic, in exactly the same pattern that had played out with the front seat law 8 years earlier. Adult rear seatbelt wearing jumped from that low starting point of around 10% straight up to roughly 40% almost overnight. That's not a complete transformation, and compliance with rear seatbelt wearing has continued to improve gradually in the years since. But the scale of that immediate jump shows once again exactly how much more effective a legal requirement was at changing behavior than years of voluntary advertising and persuasion ever managed to be on its own. It's worth understanding why this final piece of the puzzle took so much longer to arrive than the other parts. Each stage of seatbelt legislation in Britain had to clear its own separate political hurdle, and the arguments used to resist each stage echoed the arguments that had already been used against the stages before it. The same concerns about personal freedom that had delayed front seat legislation throughout the 1970s resurfaced again when rear seat fitting requirements were debated, and resurfaced once more when the question turned to whether children, and later adults, should be legally required to actually use those belts. Each step forward had to fight through the same basic objection, that the state shouldn't be telling people what to strap across their own bodies inside their own private vehicle, even as the safety case for doing exactly that became stronger and better evidenced with every passing year. There's also a practical reason rear seat legislation lagged so far behind the front seat equivalent, and it comes down to something as simple as which cars actually had rear belts fitted in the first place. Manufacturing standards requiring rear seat belts to be fitted in new cars only arrived in 1987, which meant that for nearly 2 decades after front belts became compulsory equipment, plenty of cars on British roads, including many still being driven well into the 1980s, simply didn't have a rear belt to wear, even if the law had wanted to require one. Legislating for wearing a belt that didn't physically exist in a huge number of cars on the road would have been a strange and largely unenforceable rule, which goes some way toward explaining why the wearing requirement for adults trailed so far behind the fitting requirement. Looking at the whole picture together, from 1968 right through to 1991, the story of British seatbelt law is really the story of an idea being built one small, contested step at a time, rather than arriving as a single complete system the way it might be assumed to have done. Anchorage points in 1965. Front belts as required equipment in 1968. Front belt wearing made compulsory in 1983. Rear belts as required equipment in 1987. Children in the back required to wear a belt from 1989. And finally, adults in the back brought under the same requirement in 1991, 23 years after the very first piece of this puzzle was put in place. A grandparent riding unbelted in the back seat in the 1970s wasn't taking an unusual risk that everyone else around her somehow knew to avoid. She was living through a system that genuinely hadn't finished being built yet, and wouldn't finish for another 15 or 20 years still. You knew without being told that the back seat operated by a completely different set of expectations from the front. Nobody reached back to check whether your nan or your auntie had a belt on, because the question itself hadn't really entered anyone's mind as something worth checking. That was simply how the back seat of a British car worked, for adults and children alike, for the entire span of the 1970s and most of the decade that followed it. But cars weren't the only vehicles on the road, carrying people without the protection that's taken for granted today. Step away from 4 wheels entirely and onto 2, and there was an even more dramatic gap in the law, one that closed only a handful of years into the decade itself, right at the very start of the period this whole video has been describing. 14. Riding a motorbike with no helmet on you, climbed onto the back of a moped or a motorbike with nothing on your head at all, just the wind in your hair the whole way down the road. And right at the very start of the decade, nothing in British law said you had to do anything different. This is one of the few freedoms on this list that didn't last anywhere near the whole of the 1970s. It belonged specifically to the early part of the decade, and it closed earlier than almost anything else covered so far. Riding a motorcycle or moped on a British road without a crash helmet was completely legal right up until the 1st of June 1973, when the Motorcycles, Wearing of Helmets, Regulations 1973, finally came into force and changed that for good. To understand how this came about, you have to go back further than the 1970s themselves, because the idea of compulsory helmet use had been kicking around Parliament for almost 2 decades before it finally became law. A clause that would have introduced helmet regulations was proposed as part of the Road Traffic Act back in 1956, but it failed to pass at that point. It was tried again in the Road Traffic Act 1962, and this time the clause succeeded in being included, giving the government the legal power to introduce helmet regulations whenever it chose to. But having that power and actually using it turned out to be 2 very different things. Another 11 years passed before any government actually brought forward the specific regulations needed to make helmet wearing compulsory. Those regulations were finally published on the 7th of February 1973, debated in the House of Commons on the 5th of April that same year, and brought into force on the 1st of June 1973. What's striking about this particular law, compared to the seatbelt laws that took so much longer to arrive, is just how quickly it moved once it was finally introduced, and how little resistance it actually faced in practice, despite a vocal opposition in Parliament. The debate held on the 5th of April 1973 saw MPs from across the political spectrum arguing both sides, with several describing the new requirement as a gross infringement of personal liberty. The most eloquent opponent in that debate was the MP Enoch Powell, who argued at length that forcing an individual to protect their own safety through legislation set a dangerous precedent, one that could eventually justify the government regulating almost any personal choice a citizen might make, on the grounds that it affected their own welfare or that of their family. Despite that opposition, the regulations passed and came into force exactly on schedule. What makes this particularly interesting is a detail that came up directly in that same parliamentary debate. By the time the law was introduced, an estimated 88% of motorcyclists in Britain were already choosing to wear a helmet voluntarily, without any legal requirement forcing them to. The new law, in other words, wasn't dragging a reluctant majority into line. It was mainly catching the smaller minority who'd chosen not to wear one, and turning what had already become the common, sensible choice for most riders into a legal requirement for everyone. This stands in fairly sharp contrast to the seatbelt story running through the rest of this video, where voluntary compliance before the law changed sat at around 40% for front seats and as low as 10% for adults in the back seat. With motorcycle helmets, the country had already largely talked itself into the habit before the law arrived. That probably explains why this particular piece of road safety legislation moved through Parliament and into force so much faster than the seatbelt equivalent, even though both raised exactly the same kind of personal liberty argument in debate. There was real history behind why helmets had already become so widely accepted before the law caught up. During the Second World War, a neurosurgeon named Dr. Hugh Cairns had recommended that British Army motorcycle dispatch riders, who carried messages and orders between commanders and the front lines, should be required to wear crash helmets while on duty. That recommendation was accepted by the Army, and crash helmets became compulsory for all Army motorcyclists from November 1941 onward. Cairns had become concerned about head injuries on motorcycles years earlier, after treating T.E. Lawrence, known to most people as Lawrence of Arabia, for the head injuries that ultimately killed him following a motorcycle crash in May 1935. That military precedent, established more than 3 decades before the civilian law finally arrived, had already done a great deal of the work in shaping public attitudes toward helmet use long before Parliament caught up with a law to match it. Not everyone accepted the change quietly, even once it had become law. A retired schoolteacher named Fred Hill, who had himself been a wartime motorcycle dispatch rider, became one of the most determined campaigners against the new helmet law, refusing to comply with it and accumulating dozens of fines as a result. Rather than pay those fines, Hill chose imprisonment instead, and between 1976 and 1984, he served a total of 31 separate prison sentences for contempt of court, arising directly from his refusal to pay. He continued riding without a helmet right up until his death in February 1984, suffering a heart attack while serving his 31st sentence in Pentonville Prison. The organization he supported through this campaign, the Motorcycle Action Group, was founded specifically in response to the 1973 law and continues to exist today, still arguing that the choice to wear a helmet should belong to the individual rider rather than the state. There's one further detail worth knowing, because it shaped this law's reach in a way that's still true today. From 1976 onward, members of the Sikh community wearing a turban gained a specific religious exemption from the helmet requirement, a position that remains written into law to this day. That exemption itself became a point of controversy for campaigners like Fred Hill, who argued that if one community could be exempted on religious grounds, the entire principle of the law was undermined, although he was careful to insist his objection was about consistency rather than the exemption itself. You knew, if you were riding a motorbike right at the very start of the 1970s, that this particular freedom had an expiry date attached to it, arriving sooner than almost anything else covered in this whole story. From the 1st of June 1973 onward, every motorcyclist and moped rider in Britain, with that one specific religious exception, was required by law to wear a helmet, a rule that has stayed in place, largely unchanged, for more than 50 years since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But while the roads themselves had already begun tightening up by the middle of the decade, there was a much bigger and far less visible freedom still completely untouched by any law at all, one that had nothing to do with vehicles or roads, and everything to do with simply being allowed to disappear for an entire afternoon with nobody having the slightest idea where you actually were. 15. Disappearing. For the whole day unsupervised. You left the house straight after breakfast, told your mum you'd be back when it got dark, and that was it. Nobody asked exactly where you were going. Nobody expected you to check in. You simply went, and you came home again when the streetlights came on. This wasn't neglect, and it wasn't unusual. It was simply how childhood independence worked for an enormous number of children growing up in Britain in the 1970s. There was no mobile phone in your pocket, because mobile phones for ordinary use didn't exist yet. There was no way for a parent to reach you once you'd disappeared round the corner, and no way for you to reach them either, short of finding a phone box and having the right coins on you. The whole concept of a child being trackable, contactable, or checkable throughout the day simply wasn't part of how families operated, because the technology that would eventually make that possible hadn't arrived. The scale of just how much freedom children actually had during this period isn't something that has to be guessed at or remembered fondly through rose-tinted glasses. It was measured directly by a piece of research that has become one of the most cited studies in this entire field. In 1971, researchers carried out a survey across several communities in England, looking specifically at how independently children were allowed to move around. They found that 80% of 7- and 8-year-old children were allowed to travel to school entirely on their own, without any adult accompanying them at all. The same research team went back and repeated the exact same survey in 1990, using the same questions in comparable communities, and found that the figure had collapsed to just 9%. In under 2 decades, the proportion of young children allowed to make that same short journey alone had fallen from 4 out of every 5 children to fewer than 1 in 10. That study, published as One False Move by the Policy Studies Institute in 1990, looked at far more than just the walk to school. It also asked whether children were allowed to cross main roads on their own, travel by bus or bike without an adult, and go out after dark. Across every single one of these measures, the pattern was the same. Children in 1971 ranged further, more often, and with far less adult oversight than the children being surveyed in 1990, even though the parents involved in the later survey often admitted, when asked directly, that they themselves had enjoyed exactly that kind of freedom as children. They simply weren't willing to extend the same freedom to their own sons and daughters anymore. What makes this particular shift especially interesting is what the researchers found when they looked at the actual safety data behind it. Between 1971 and 1990, the amount of traffic on British roads had nearly doubled, and yet, over that exact same period, the number of children killed on those roads had actually fallen by roughly half. In other words, the country's roads had become measurably safer for children during precisely the same years that parents were pulling their children's independence back further and further. The researchers behind the study argued that this pattern challenged a widely held assumption that rising fear about children's safety on the roads was simply tracking a rising real danger. The actual numbers told a different story. Children in 1971 weren't ranging freely because the roads were safer back then. If anything, the opposite was closer to the truth. This freedom to simply disappear for hours wasn't built on a careful, considered decision by parents that the world was safe enough to allow it. It was built on a set of assumptions, habits, and practical realities that simply hadn't been questioned yet. In a country where most households had one telephone, fixed permanently to a wall in the hallway, and absolutely no way of reaching a child once that child had walked out the front door. If you wanted your child home, you relied on an agreed time, the position of the sun, the sound of the dinner being put on the table, or simply shouting their name out of the back door and hoping they were close enough to hear it. This produced a particular kind of childhood geography that's almost impossible to recreate today. Children built their own maps of the local area, learned which back alleys, fields, building sites, and patches of waste ground belonged to which group of kids, and moved through entire neighborhoods with a level of detailed local knowledge that most adults, let alone parents trying to track their movements, simply didn't share. A child might spend an entire Saturday cycling several miles from home, exploring a quarry, a disused railway line, or a stretch of woodland, entirely outside any adult's direct knowledge of where they actually were, returning only because hunger or darkness eventually pulled them back. It's worth being honest about the obvious gap this created. The same gap that the One False Move researchers were specifically trying to measure and understand. Children given this much unsupervised freedom were, by definition, beyond the direct protection of any adult for long stretches of every single day. Accidents happened. Some children were injured, occasionally seriously, in incidents that no adult was present to prevent or respond to quickly. But the wider statistical picture the researchers uncovered, of falling child road deaths even as traffic doubled, suggests that the freedom itself wasn't the primary danger that later generations of parents came to believe it was. Something else was driving the steady tightening of children's independence through the decades that followed, separate from any genuine rise in real risk. There's a wider cultural shift bound up in all of this, that the researchers themselves pointed to directly. The German communities surveyed alongside the English ones in 1990 showed substantially higher levels of children's independent mobility than their English counterparts, despite having broadly similar levels of car ownership and traffic. That comparison suggested the dramatic change happening in England wasn't simply a universal, inevitable consequence of more cars on the road. It reflected something more specific to British culture and British parenting attitudes during this exact period. A shift in how much freedom adults were willing to extend to children, running ahead of any actual change in how dangerous the world around those children had become. You knew, growing up in the 1970s, that disappearing for the day was simply what childhood looked like. Nobody handed you a mobile phone, because none existed for you to carry. Nobody expected updates throughout the day, because there was no way to provide them, even if anyone had wanted to. You went out, you came home, and the hours in between belonged entirely to you, in a way that the children who came directly after you would gradually, year by year, find shrinking smaller and smaller around them. And while children moved through entire unsupervised afternoons outside, the indoor spaces they eventually came home to, the buses they rode, the pubs their parents took them into, and the waiting rooms they sat in when somebody fell ill, were filled with a haze that surrounded children just as completely, one that nobody at the time thought to question either. 16. Growing up, surrounded by smoke. You sat in the back of the bus on the top deck, in the seats right at the front that everyone wanted, and the whole upper level was thick with cigarette smoke, drifting up from nearly every seat around you. Nobody opened a window to clear it. Nobody complained to the conductor. It was simply how the top deck of a bus smelled, the same way a pub smelled, the same way a hospital waiting room smelled, the same way the staff room at your school probably smelled, if you ever got close enough to catch a whiff of it through an open door. Smoking wasn't confined to certain rooms or certain moments. It happened almost everywhere, in front of almost everyone, including children, without any law standing in the way of it. To understand just how completely smoking was woven into ordinary public life at the time, it helps to look at exactly how many people were doing it. According to the General Household Survey, which began recording smoking habits in detail from 1974 onward, 51% of men and 41% of women in Britain smoked cigarettes that year. That's not a small or unusual minority. That's roughly half the adult population lighting up regularly, in a country with no restrictions on where most of that smoking could actually happen. If you were a child in the 1970s, more than half the men around you, and around 2 in 5 of the women, were smokers, and there was nowhere built into daily life that reliably kept you away from the smoke they produced. The places this reached are worth naming specifically, because the list covers almost every enclosed public space a child would routinely pass through. Buses allowed smoking, particularly upstairs on double-deckers, where the upper deck became so strongly associated with cigarette smoke that it was simply expected as part of the experience of riding up there. Pubs allowed smoking everywhere, in every room, with no separate non-smoking area required by any rule, which meant any child taken into a pub by a parent, whether for a family meal or simply because there was nowhere else to leave them, sat directly inside that same smoke-filled air. Hospitals allowed smoking too, in waiting rooms, in corridors, and in many cases, at a patient's own bedside, with the idea of a completely smoke-free hospital ward still decades away from becoming standard practice. Cinemas permitted it in parts of the auditorium. Workplaces permitted it almost everywhere, including staff rooms in schools, where teachers smoked between lessons as a matter of course. None of this was against the law, because the law simply didn't exist yet to stop it. The legislation that eventually banned smoking in enclosed public places across the United Kingdom arrived in stages, country by country, and every single one of those stages came decades after the period this video is describing. Scotland was the first part of the UK to introduce a ban under the Smoking, Health and Social Care Scotland Act 2005, which came into force in March 2006. Wales followed in April 2007. Northern Ireland followed later that same month. England came last, with its own ban under the Health Act 2006 finally taking effect on the 1st of July 2007. Until each of those specific dates arrived, in each separate part of the country, there was no general law preventing smoking in pubs, restaurants, shops, workplaces, or any other enclosed public space anywhere in the UK. A child growing up through the 1970s was growing up an entire generation before any of that protection existed. It's worth being precise about exactly why this didn't strike anyone at the time as a problem worth legislating against. Public understanding of secondhand smoke as a specific, measurable health risk to people who weren't smoking themselves was still developing through this period. The dangers of smoking itself, to the smoker, were already well established and widely accepted by the 1970s, following decades of medical research linking cigarettes to lung cancer and heart disease. But the idea that the smoke drifting off someone else's cigarette could meaningfully harm a person sitting nearby who wasn't smoking at all, including a child with no choice in the matter, hadn't yet become the settled, mainstream understanding that it is today. Without that understanding firmly in place, there was very little public pressure pushing for the kind of restrictions that eventually arrived in the 2000s. This meant a child's exposure to smoke through the decade wasn't something parents were actively trying to minimize or avoid. It was treated as background noise, an unavoidable feature of being out in the world, no different in kind from traffic fumes or the smell of a coal fire. A baby might be wheeled through a smoke-filled waiting room without anyone present giving it a second thought. A child might spend an entire car journey in a vehicle filled with cigarette smoke, windows up against the cold, with the smoking adult in the front seat seeing nothing unusual in lighting up, with children present in the back. None of this reflected carelessness on the part of individual parents. It reflected a country where the entire culture, right up to the level of government policy, simply hadn't yet drawn the connection between other people's smoking and a non-smoker's health in the way it eventually would. The eventual change, when it did come, happened remarkably quickly once the underlying medical evidence had built up sufficiently and political will finally caught up with it. From the first ban in Scotland in 2006 to the last one taking effect in England in 2007, the entire United Kingdom moved from having essentially no restriction on smoking in enclosed public places to a comprehensive, nationwide ban within little more than a year. That's a strikingly fast transition for a habit that had been so deeply embedded in everyday British life for the entire preceding century. And it shows how quickly public attitudes and public policy can shift once the case for change becomes accepted as settled rather than disputed. You knew, growing up in the 1970s, that smoke was simply part of the air you breathed in most of the indoor places you went. Nobody asked whether you minded it, because nobody saw it as something you'd have any particular reason to mind. The top deck of the bus smelled the way it smelled. The pub smelled the way it smelled. That was simply the texture of public life in Britain at the time, woven so completely into the everyday world that an entire generation of children grew up inside it, without anyone around them, treating it as anything other than ordinary. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and while the air around you carried this particular invisible hazard everywhere you went, there was another one running quietly underneath daily life altogether, built directly into the very fabric of the cars on the road and the paint on the walls of the houses you grew up in. 17. Growing up around Leeds. You walked to school every morning along a road thick with traffic, breathing in fumes from every car that passed, and every single one of those exhaust pipes was pumping out a toxic metal that nobody at the time fully understood was reaching you. That metal was lead, and it had been part of British petrol since the 1920s, when a chemical called tetraethyl lead was first added to fuel to stop car engines from knocking under pressure. By the time you were growing up in the 1970s, leaded petrol wasn't a fringe product. It was the standard fuel sitting in the tank of almost every car on the road, and every mile that car drove released tiny particles of lead straight into the air around it. Researchers later estimated that between 1970 and the end of the century, roughly 140,000 tons of lead were released into the atmosphere from exhaust pipes in the UK alone. A huge proportion of that came during exactly the decade this video is describing. To understand how concentrated that exposure actually was, it helps to look at the measurements taken at the time. Average airborne lead concentrations in central London during the 1960s sat at more than 1,000 nanograms per cubic meter of air. By comparison, today's levels sit below 10 nanograms per cubic meter, more than 100 times lower. Children walking to school, playing in streets close to busy roads, or simply living in towns and cities with heavy traffic, were breathing air carrying a level of airborne lead that would be considered alarming by any modern standard. And at the time, almost nobody around them realized the scale of what was happening. The reason this took so long to address comes down to exactly how slowly the science and the politics moved together. The dangers of lead exposure to children's developing brains had actually been understood in some form for decades before leaded petrol was finally phased out. But removing lead from fuel meant overhauling the entire national fuel supply, redesigning engines that had been built to rely on lead's particular chemical properties, and persuading both the public and the motor industry that the change was worth the cost and inconvenience involved. That process moved gradually through the 1970s and 1980s, picking up real momentum once catalytic converters, which require unleaded fuel to function correctly, began appearing in cars during that period. The European Union eventually set a firm cutoff date, banning leaded petrol from sale from the 1st of January 2000 onward, under a directive that Britain, as a member at the time, was bound to follow. In practice, leaded petrol had effectively disappeared from UK forecourts by 1999, the year before that formal ban took full effect. That means a child growing up through the entire 1970s lived through more than 2 decades of leaded petrol use before the country finally moved away from it. The effect of that exposure wasn't an abstract or theoretical risk. Lead is now understood to affect the developing brain and nervous system in children specifically, with research showing it can impair cognitive function, attention, and behavior, and there is no level of lead exposure in children that's considered entirely safe. None of that understanding had filtered through into firm government policy by the time leaded petrol was still being pumped into family cars every single week throughout the decade. Petrol fumes weren't the only source of lead a child in the 1970s was likely to encounter either. Lead had also been a common ingredient in household paint for generations, prized for its durability and its ability to produce bright, long-lasting colors. Houses built or decorated before the change in regulations frequently had layers of lead-based paint on doors, window frames, and skirting boards, paint that could chip, flake, or be chewed by a curious toddler without anyone necessarily realizing the specific danger involved. As far back as 1963, paint manufacturers had introduced a voluntary labeling system, warning that products containing more than a certain proportion of lead shouldn't be applied to surfaces a child might chew on, an early sign that some awareness of the risk already existed even then. But that labeling was voluntary, not compulsory, and it did nothing to address the enormous amount of lead-based paint already sitting on walls and woodwork in homes right across the country by the time the 1970s arrived. The actual legal ban on selling lead paint in the UK didn't arrive until 1992 under the Environmental Protection, Controls on Injurious Substances regulations, which brought British law in line with a wider European ban on the substance. That's a full 20 years or more after the period this video has been describing, which means every single house decorated through the 1970s, using ordinary, widely available paint, had a real chance of containing lead, whether the family living there had any idea of it or not. Children growing up in older houses, in particular, were often surrounded by surfaces coated in paint that had been applied years or decades earlier, layered up over time, with each fresh coat simply going on top of whatever lead-based paint already lay underneath. It's worth being clear about why none of this produced the kind of alarm or urgency that might be expected looking back on it now. Both leaded petrol and lead paint had been part of ordinary British life for so long, used so widely and for so many decades, that their presence simply wasn't treated as something requiring active concern from individual families. Parents weren't ignoring a warning that everyone else somehow understood and avoided. The warning itself, in any form that reached ordinary households with real force, simply hadn't been issued yet. The slow build of scientific evidence linking childhood lead exposure to genuine cognitive and developmental harm took years to translate into firm regulation, and during all of those years, children kept breathing the exhaust from leaded petrol and kept living inside houses decorated with lead-based paint, entirely unaware that either one carried any particular risk at all. There's a wider pattern worth noticing here, one that connects back to several of the other freedoms and exposures covered earlier in this whole story. Britain through the 1970s was a country still working out, piece by piece, exactly which everyday substances and habits actually carried hidden dangers, and how seriously those dangers needed to be taken once they'd been identified. Lead in petrol and lead in paint sit alongside cigarette smoke in public spaces as exactly this kind of slow realization, something that had been quietly present in ordinary life for generations, before the evidence finally accumulated enough weight to force a change in the law. You knew, growing up through this decade, that the air by a busy road simply smelled the way it smelled, and that the paint on an old window frame was simply part of how an older house looked. Nobody told you there was anything to worry about in either one, because the understanding that would eventually lead to both being banned hadn't yet built up enough force to reach an ordinary household. That was simply the texture of the world you grew up in, invisible, widespread, and almost entirely unaddressed for the whole of the decade. And while lead sat quietly in the air outside and in the paint on the walls, there was another substance built directly into the very structure of the school buildings themselves, hidden inside ceiling tiles and partition walls, that an entire generation of British schoolchildren sat underneath every single day, without anyone around them having the faintest idea it was there. 18. Sitting beneath asbestos ceiling tiles. You sat at your desk under a ceiling made of soft grey tiles, in a classroom built quickly and cheaply in the years after the war, and woven directly into the structure of that building was a material that would go on to kill thousands of people who'd once sat in rooms exactly like it. That material was asbestos, and through the 1950s, 1960s, and right through the 1970s, it was used extensively in the construction of schools right across Britain. The post-war years had left the country needing huge numbers of new school buildings quickly and cheaply, and asbestos offered exactly what builders were looking for at the time. It was fireproof, it didn't conduct electricity, it resisted damp, and it was remarkably cheap to produce and install. A particular building method known as CLASP, standing for Consortium of Local Authorities Special Program, used lightweight steel frames with panel infill to construct schools quickly across the country between 1945 and 1980, and these system-built structures relied heavily on asbestos-containing materials as part of their basic design, including fireproofing wrapped around structural steel columns. The scale of how widely this material was used inside an ordinary school is worth being specific about. Asbestos turned up in spray coatings, applied to concrete walls and ceilings, and onto steelwork for fire protection and insulation. It was used as lagging, wrapped around pipework, boilers, and ducts. It appeared in insulation boards used in heating equipment and in protective mats inside laboratories. And it was mixed into asbestos cement products, including wall panels, ceiling panels, corrugated roof panels, floor tiles, guttering, and pipes. In other words, asbestos wasn't tucked away in one obscure corner of a typical 1970s school building. It was built into the walls, the ceilings, the roof, the pipework, and in plenty of schools, the science labs as well. What makes this particular danger so different from almost everything else covered earlier in this whole story is that the medical evidence linking asbestos exposure to serious illness wasn't a later discovery that simply hadn't reached Britain yet by the 1970s. Scientists had already established a clear link between asbestos exposure and serious disease, including the fatal cancer mesothelioma, as far back as the 1960s. That means children sitting in classrooms built or refurbished with asbestos-containing materials throughout the entire 1970s were doing so during a period when the danger was already scientifically understood, even though almost nobody at the school gate, in the classroom, or in the local education authority office had any reason to connect that understanding to the actual building they were sitting in every day. The legal response to that growing understanding moved in stages, and it moved slowly. The import of crocidolite, known as blue asbestos, one of the most dangerous types, was voluntarily stopped in 1969. The spraying of asbestos as a building technique ceased on a voluntary basis in 1974. But it wasn't until 1985 that Britain introduced its first proper legal ban, prohibiting the import, supply, and use of blue and brown asbestos specifically. White asbestos, known as chrysotile, was mistakenly believed at the time to be considerably less dangerous than the blue and brown varieties, and it remained completely legal to use for a further 14 years after that first ban, finally being outlawed in 1999, when asbestos use of every kind was banned outright across Britain for good. This means a child sitting in a British classroom throughout the entire decade of the 1970s was attending school in buildings constructed using a material that science already understood to be dangerous, inside a country that wouldn't introduce its first legal restriction on that material for another 8 to 15 years, depending on the specific type involved, and wouldn't ban it completely for nearly 3 decades. The gap between scientific understanding and legal action, in this particular case, stretched across an entire generation of British schoolchildren. The consequences of that gap weren't theoretical. In a landmark 2011 ruling, the Supreme Court accepted that a woman named Diane Wilmore had died from mesothelioma as a direct result of asbestos exposure during her time as a pupil at Bowring Comprehensive School in Liverpool during the 1970s. That case stands as direct legal confirmation at the highest court in the country that a child attending a perfectly ordinary British secondary school during exactly this decade could be exposed to asbestos in a way that would, decades later, prove fatal. In 2012, Professor Julian Peto, one of the country's leading experts in asbestos-related cancers, told a parliamentary select committee that he estimated between 200 and 300 adults who had attended school during the 1960s and 1970s would die every single year as a direct result of asbestos exposure during their school years. It's worth understanding exactly why this particular danger was so much harder for anyone at the time to notice or act on, compared to something like a board rubber thrown across a classroom or an unbelted seat in a car. Asbestos is dangerous, specifically when its fibers become airborne and are then inhaled. And undisturbed asbestos, sitting quietly inside a ceiling tile or a wall panel, can remain present for years without releasing any visible sign of danger at all. There was no smell, no obvious texture, nothing a child or a teacher could point to and recognize as a risk. The material simply sat there, doing exactly the job it had been installed to do, fireproofing and insulating an ordinary school building. while quietly carrying a long-term danger that wouldn't reveal itself in many cases for 20, 30, or even 40 years after the original exposure took place. There's a sobering scale to how far this issue still reaches today, which helps put the 1970s exposure into proper context. Research and government surveys carried out in more recent years have repeatedly found that around 80% of state schools in England still contain asbestos somewhere in their buildings, much of it dating directly from this exact construction boom of the 1950s through to the 1980s. Nobody ever undertook a systematic, nationwide effort to remove the asbestos already installed in schools once the bans of 1985 and 1999 took effect. The material simply stayed exactly where it had been built in, managed in place rather than removed, which is why children attending British schools today are still, in many cases, sitting in classrooms built with the very same material that was already being installed throughout the decade this video has been describing. You knew nothing about any of this, sitting at your desk in the 1970s. There was no reason you would have known. Nobody around you, not your teachers, not your parents, not even most of the people responsible for building and maintaining the school itself, had any practical reason to connect the soft grey ceiling tiles above your head to a scientific finding from the 1960s that most ordinary people had never heard of. That was simply the ceiling of your classroom, doing exactly what it was put there to do, while quietly carrying a risk that wouldn't be properly addressed in British law for years still to come. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while that particular danger sat hidden inside the very walls and ceilings of the school building itself, there was another part of growing up in Britain through this decade that involved something far more visible and far more openly discussed, a kind of physical discipline that took place not at school, but at home, carried out by a parent rather than a teacher, and one that, remarkably, has never actually been made illegal in England to this very day. 19. Being smacked at home. Your mum or your dad gave you a smack, right there in the kitchen or across the back seat of the car, for whatever you'd just done. And nobody outside that house, no teacher, no neighbor, no policeman, ever had cause to ask a single question about it. This was simply how discipline worked inside an enormous number of British households through the 1970s. A smack on the legs, a slap on the back of the hand, a clip round the ear, these were treated as ordinary, unremarkable parts of raising a child. No different in legal standing from sending a child to bed early or taking away their pocket money. Nobody thought of it as something that needed hiding, and nobody thought of it as something the law might one day take an interest in. Here's the part of this particular story that genuinely surprises people when they hear it properly explained, because it isn't really a story about something that changed and then stopped. In England and in Northern Ireland, smacking a child at home, carried out by a parent using what the law calls reasonable punishment, remains completely legal right up to this present day. This isn't a freedom that belonged only to the 1970s. It's one of the very few things on this entire list that genuinely never changed, at least not in England, where you're watching this video right now. To understand exactly where this stands today, and therefore exactly how unchanged it stayed since the decade we've been talking about throughout this whole video, it helps to look at the actual legal position, country by country. The defense of reasonable punishment, sometimes called reasonable chastisement, has long allowed a parent in England to smack their own child without committing a criminal offence, provided the force used doesn't go beyond what the law considers reasonable. That defence was given a clearer statutory basis under Section 58 of the Children Act 2004, which restricted the defence somewhat by removing it as a justification for causing actual bodily harm, but crucially, did not remove the defence for ordinary smacking itself. Northern Ireland has equivalent legislation from 2006 that operates along very similar lines. Scotland and Wales have since moved in a different direction, but only recently, and only in the years since this video's period. Scotland became the first part of the United Kingdom to remove the reasonable punishment defence entirely, with its ban on smacking children taking effect in November 2020. Wales followed shortly afterwards. with its own ban on physical punishment of children coming into force in March 2022. Both of those changes happened roughly half a century after the decade this video has been describing throughout, and both came years after similar bans had already been introduced in a number of other countries around the world. It's worth putting this into wider international context, because it shows just how unusual England's continued position actually is. Sweden became the very first country in the world to ban parents from physically punishing their children back in 1979. Finland followed in 1983, then Norway in 1987, then Austria in 1989. New Zealand became the first English-speaking country to introduce a ban, doing so in 2007. Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, introduced its own ban in 2019. By the time Scotland finally banned smacking in 2020, dozens of countries around the world had already taken that step, several of them decades earlier. The position taken by successive British governments on this exact issue has remained remarkably consistent across that whole stretch of time, right up to very recent years. As recently as 2020, the UK government issued a written statement making its position explicit. A government minister stated plainly that there were no plans to bring forward legislative proposals banning parents from using physical punishment to discipline their children, adding directly that the government did not wish to interfere in how loving families bring up their children. That statement wasn't made in the 1970s. It was made decades after the period this video has been describing, which tells you something important about just how long this particular attitude has persisted in English law and English politics, almost entirely unchanged from the assumptions that governed family life throughout the whole of the decade we've been exploring. This makes smacking genuinely different from almost every other example covered in this whole video. The boot of the car, the unbelted seatbelt, the witch's hat roundabout, the fireworks from the corner shop, the penknife in the pocket. All of these represent freedoms that have since been closed off by new laws, new standards, or new restrictions that simply didn't exist in the 1970s. Smacking sits in a different category entirely. It represents a continuity rather than a change, a single thread running directly from the parenting habits of a 1970s household straight through to the present day, in England at least, without the law ever stepping in to draw a hard line the way it eventually did for almost everything else on this list. There's something worth reflecting on in exactly why this particular issue has proven so much harder to legislate against than seatbelts, fireworks, or playground equipment. Every other change covered in this video involved either a clear technical safety standard, like a critical fall height or a category of explosive, or a clearly defined public space, like a school, a road, or a shop counter. Smacking touches something different, the relationship between a parent and their own child inside their own home, and that particular boundary between family privacy and state intervention has proven far harder for successive governments to cross than almost any other area of child safety regulation covered throughout this whole story. The government's own language in 2020 about not wishing to interfere in how loving families bring up their children captures exactly this hesitation, repeated across decades by governments of differing political colors, all reaching broadly the same conclusion that this particular line shouldn't be crossed. Research carried out by groups campaigning against corporal punishment has consistently argued that where smacking has been banned elsewhere in the world, there's been a clear increase in the identification of children at risk of physical abuse, alongside a lower rate of mortality linked to child abuse more generally. That argument has been made repeatedly to successive UK governments over many years, and it has, so far, persuaded Scotland and Wales, but not yet England or Northern Ireland. You knew, growing up through the 1970s, that a smack was simply one of the tools a parent had available, used without any sense that the law might ever take an interest in the matter. What's genuinely striking, looking back from today, is that this one particular piece of 1970s parenting hasn't actually become a piece of nostalgic history at all. In England, it remains exactly as legal today as it was then, a single unbroken thread running the whole way from that decade through to the present moment, while almost everything else covered in this entire story has long since been closed off by changes in the law. And while what happened inside the home stayed largely untouched by any new rule, there was one more place where the physical world of growing up in the 1970s operated by its own completely separate code, a place where children settled their own disputes with their fists, in full view of the staff responsible for stopping exactly that kind of thing, and where almost nobody in authority felt any pressing need to intervene. 20. Settling it with fists in the playground. Two boys squared up behind the bike sheds. A small crowd gathered to watch, and a teacher walking past glanced over, decided it wasn't worth the bother, and kept walking. This wasn't every school, and it wasn't every teacher, but it was common enough that almost anyone who went through a British school in the 1970s remembers it happening, openly, with adults nearby who simply chose not to intervene. A playground scrap was treated as something boys sorted out between themselves, a normal part of growing up, rather than an incident requiring formal action, paperwork, or a phone call home. The reason this could happen so freely comes down to something that's easy to miss looking back from today. There was no legal framework requiring a school to do anything about it. The entire structure of anti-bullying law that now governs every British school simply didn't exist yet. Schools weren't legally required to have an anti-bullying policy at all until the Education and Inspections Act 2006, which placed a clear duty on head teachers to determine measures preventing bullying among pupils, and to publish those measures in writing for parents and staff. Before that act, no law specifically obliged a school to have any written policy on bullying whatsoever. The Education Act 2002 had already placed a general duty on schools to safeguard children's welfare, but the specific, named duty to prevent bullying came 4 years later still, decades after the period this video has been describing. That means a child in a 1970s playground was operating inside a system with no legal requirement for a written behavior policy addressing bullying, no statutory guidance from the Department for Education on how staff should respond, and none of the safeguarding architecture that today links a playground incident to child protection procedures under the Children Act 1989, itself not passed until 1989. There was no equivalent of today's expectation that incidents be logged, that patterns be tracked, or that parents be formally notified. A fight behind the bike sheds simply happened, was sometimes broken up by whichever adult happened to be nearby, and was very often left to settle itself. This fits the wider pattern running through this entire story. Time and again, the freedoms and exposures covered here weren't cases of rules being broken, they were cases of rules not yet existing, whether that meant a seatbelt law still 15 years away, a fireworks age restriction still 3 decades off, or, in this final case, an entire legal framework for protecting children from each other that wouldn't be built until well into the following century. Looking back across everything covered in this story, from the boot of the car to the fists behind the bike sheds, a single thread runs through all of it. Britain in the 1970s wasn't a country that had decided to take fewer precautions with its children. It was a country that simply hadn't built the precautions yet. One law, one standard, one piece of guidance at a time, across decades that stretched long after the children living through that decade had grown up and had children of their own. Whatever else changed in the years that followed, that gap between what we now expect and what once simply wasn't there yet, is the real story behind every single thing on this list. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.